The 42-day Gaza ceasefire has now expired. After extensive security consultations overnight, Israel adopted U.S. Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff's proposal for a ceasefire extension in Gaza over the Ramadan and Passover holidays. Hamas has not accepted the proposal, and Israel announced it was halting humanitarian aid into Gaza and is prepared to resume the war. More from ILTV's Steve Leibowitz.
Overnight security talks headed by Prime Minister Netanyahu coincided with the official end of Phase 1 of the Gaza ceasefire deal at midnight. Following the deliberations, Jerusalem announced that it accepted the U.S. plan for a ceasefire extension through the Muslim and Jewish holidays of Ramadan and Passover. According to the Witkoff plan, on the first day of the framework, half of the living hostages and remaining deceased hostages would be released after the agreement is signed. If an agreement is then negotiated for a permanent ceasefire, the remaining living and deceased hostages would be freed. The first phase of the ceasefire deal came to an end last night. An Israeli negotiating team is expected to return to Cairo to join mediators from Egypt and Qatar with U.S. support. For the time being, U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff has yet again delayed his planned visit to join the talks. A statement from the Prime Minister's office notes that Hamas has so far remained firm in its refusal to accept the Witkoff plan. Israeli officials say that if Hamas changes its position, Israel would immediately enter talks on details of the framework. If Hamas stays out of the talks, Israel reserves the right to return to war, and the IDF is prepared to do so if ordered. In the meantime, Israel announced the halt to humanitarian aid into Gaza. Backing the possible Israeli return to war in Gaza, the U.S. approved the expedited delivery of some $4 billion in military aid. The weapons include over $2 billion for heavy bombs and penetrator warheads and nearly $300 million for armored bulldozers.
After 491 days, that's 16 months in Hamas captivity, released hostage Eli Sharabi is finally free. But his ordeal is far from over. In his first courageous interview since his release, he recounts the horrors he endured, the relentless beatings, the psychological terror, but above all, the starvation, the hunger.
שאנשים יחשבו טוב טוב בבית כשהם פותחים מקרר, זה עולם ומלואו. זה עולם ומלואו לפתוח מקרר. המושג הזה בכלל, של אדם חופשי שיכול לקחת משם פרי או ירק, או ביצה, או מים, או שק לחם. על זה אתה חולם כל יום. לא אכפת לך מהמכות שאתה חוטף, ואתה חוטף מכות, ושוברים לי צלעות. לא אכפת לי.
הרעב.
תן לי עוד חצי פיתה.
אפשר להסביר את התחושה של הרעב?
אי אפשר.
זה הבטן שנדבקת לגב?
בטן שנדבקת לגב, אבל אתה כבר רואה את הבטן שלך ממש נכנסת פנימה באיזשהו שלב, ואתה לא מאמין שזה קורה לגוף שלך.
Sharabi, a 53-year-old man, returned from captivity weighing just 44 kilograms. His body is weak, but his spirit remains unbroken. U.S. President Donald Trump reportedly watched Sharabi's emotional and gut-wrenching testimony on Israeli television and invited him to the White House. Despite his fragile condition, his brother Sharon, who has been fighting relentlessly for his release since his abduction on October 7th, says this is a critical moment for the hostages still in Gaza, and so the two will try to make the journey to Washington. After watching the full-length interview, one thing is certain: Eli Sharabi is no ordinary man. In fact, he really is one of a kind. He survived brutal captivity in Gaza. His wife and 2 daughters were murdered by Hamas. His brother Eli died in captivity. His home was destroyed. And yet somehow he still finds the strength to be grateful, to speak up, and to fight, not for himself, but for those who remain behind. And as negotiations for the second phase of a ceasefire remain stalled, families of the remaining hostages are left in limbo, desperate for answers and running out of hope.
Families of the remaining hostages are grappling with anguish, unable to hold on to hope as negotiations for the next phase of the ceasefire remain at a standstill. With no clear answers, these families live in constant fear of the unknown. Meanwhile, in a cruel and calculated move, Hamas released a video showing freed hostage Yair Horn alongside his brother Eitan in their final moments together before Yair's release. A deliberate act of psychological warfare, the footage forces viewers to witness the unbearable, the agonizing farewell of brothers torn apart by terror. Former hostage Omer Shem Tov was released from the hospital Saturday after completing medical tests. Shem Tov, who suffers from asthma and celiac disease, spent 505 days in captivity with little access to proper food or medicine. Today, Israel bid farewell to another victim of Hamas's brutality, Shlomo Mansour. Kidnapped from Kibbutz Kisufim on October 7th, Mansour was murdered in Gaza. Hundreds attended his funeral, mourning yet another life stolen by terror. For former hostage Romi Gonen, this Saturday was painfully different. She wrote, "It's the first Saturday since my return that no brothers and sisters of ours are coming home." Her message is clear. The fight cannot stop. With negotiations stalled and families in anguish, the pressure is mounting for a breakthrough. The second phase of the ceasefire deal remains uncertain, but for those still in captivity, time is running out.
For generations, owning a home in Eretz Yisrael has been a cherished dream, one of faith, heritage, and belonging. Now, with Sparta Real Estate, that dream is within reach. From the spiritual heart of Jerusalem to the vibrant Jewish life of Vernana, the seaside beauty of Netanya, or the energy of Tel Aviv, Eliyahu Kleinman will guide you every step of the way. With beautiful homes at various price points and all bureaucracy handled for you, it's never been easier. Scan the QR code now, and Eliyahu will personally help you find your home in Israel.
Joining us now is Gerald Steinberg, CEO of NGO Monitor. Thank you for joining us. We know that there have been efforts to extend the first stage of the hostage and ceasefire deal and for Hamas to release additional Israeli hostages, or what we now know as the Witkoff plan. But Hamas refused, and now we're hearing Israel stopped the entry of aid into Gaza in response to their refusal. What do you make of all of this?
First of all, the provision of aid to Gaza allows Hamas to maintain its structure. It allows them to perhaps regroup. It allows them to attack Israelis in the future. It allows them to keep millions of people, 1.5, maybe up to 1.7 million people in Gaza under strict control by this terrorist organization, this jihadist terrorist organization. And that is what Israel went to war to stop. And if humanitarian aid continues to go in, they will regroup. That was the biggest mistake that the Biden and Lincoln administration did. They did it for very basic electoral reasons to appease the constituencies in the United States. They nevertheless lost the election. And now the Trump administration has said, we don't have to put that pressure on you anymore. We are not going to force you to provide aid, which goes to Hamas anyway. It's called aid. But in fact, as we've all seen the pictures, all those tunnels where the Israeli hostages were brutalized, were tortured, were kept in some cases like the Bibas family murdered, that was all stolen from aid. And that's a critical point here. This is not Israel imposing some sort of new condition. It is trying to send a message to Hamas and its backers in Qatar and elsewhere that can put pressure on Hamas. What was before will not continue. You will not get aid if you continue to hold the hostages. So I think there is a chance now that we will have something different, that the Hamas leadership will understand, will get pressured, will be forced to agree to the Witkoff plan, which still allows them, unfortunately, to hold on to hostages, half the remaining hostages, for a number of days or weeks. But if Israel can get half of those hostages back in the next week or two, that will be a tremendous breakthrough. That's the only game in town.
Now, at the moment, are we at a standstill? Hamas must have a lot to lose if the deal collapses. They certainly rely on this aid and also on caravans and tents needed for housing. Is it not within their interest to keep the ceasefire going and the aid pouring in?
One of the biggest problems, I'd say this as an academic who taught international relations for 40 years, and now look at this, and we taught our students about looking at rational actors, at interests, at power. We're not sure, I'm not sure at all, that Hamas makes rational decisions. October 7th was an irrational decision and a rational policy. They thought that perhaps they could get a big uprising against Israel. They totally failed. And yet they're maintaining that same policy now over 500 days after October 7th. So whether Hamas is the leadership that's left, we also don't know very much about the who's left and how decisions are made among the Hamas leadership. If they are rational, they probably would have given up, would have allowed the hostages to be released in exchange for allowing 1.7, let's say, million people in Gaza to get necessary food and water and perhaps start rebuilding their lives. Hamas is desperate to maintain control. That's the real issue here. And if they can be shown that they will not be able to maintain control, if they can be broken, if Israel goes back to war, then they will lose much more gravely than they have already. That's really the issue on the table. And there's a hope. I think Qatar is a key actor. It always has been. If Qatar says what they should have said 500 days ago, we're not supporting you anymore, Hamas, unless you let the hostages go, unless you stop the fighting and the attacks against Israel. If Qatar doesn't do that, then there has to be pressure on Qatar. And there I'm somewhat skeptical. I would hope that Trump, the President Trump, the administration, and including Steve Witkoff, the special negotiator, would say to the Qataris, it's up to you to put pressure on Hamas. You're the only source of external pressure on them. You have to move, and they haven't done that yet. So we'll have to see if that's actually going to happen.
I wouldn't hold my breath waiting. If negotiations ultimately fail, how likely is a return to a full-scale war? We know that the IDF has been instructed to prepare as they're currently holding off on the perimeter. But what would that look like in practical terms?
First of all, the odds are about 100%. I very rarely predict anything. But certainly, if the hostages are not released, if there's no agreement towards that in the next, let's say, few days, maybe a week at the most, and don't forget, we're in the Ramadan month now, and there's feasting in the evenings, and this is a place and a time where there is an awareness among Hamas and its supporters that this is a critical time. If we don't get an agreement within, let's say, a week, and that's a rough number, I really don't have any inside information, I think we'll see a full-scale Israel return to Gaza. All the areas that where Israel withdrew, or the IDF withdrew, especially the Netzarim corridor in the middle, and all the other areas, north and south, I think we'll see a return to the kind of situation that we had until the ceasefire, which is large-scale movement of people in Gaza from the north to the south, from the south to the north, and full-scale IDF operations to clean up all the rest of the tunnels, all the rest of the Hamas operatives. It will be a major operation. But let's remember that they no longer have much support from Iran. Hezbollah is completely out of the picture.
Thank you very much for your input today.
Thank you.
2 Israeli civilians remain hospitalized from the car ramming attack on Thursday near Caesarea. 13 people were injured, including 1 critically and 1 seriously, when the terrorist driver rammed his car into a bus stop near the Karkor junction. The critically wounded Israeli is a 17-year-old teenage girl. After driving into the bus stop, the attacker drove another few hundred meters, hitting an officer in his car. The terrorist was eliminated at the scene. The attacker was later identified as a 53-year-old Palestinian from the Jenin area who was married to an Israeli Arab woman and was illegally living in Israel. Security was already on high alert after explosives were discovered on 5 buses in Bat Yam on February 20th. Tensions are running high across Israel and the Palestinian territories as the Muslim holy month of Ramadan has begun. In a region already on edge, concerns are mounting over the potential for escalation. Security forces are distributed, and the intention is focused on 2 key locations. First and foremost, Gaza, and right behind it, the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. And this Ramadan is unlike previous ones.
In Gaza's Khan Yunis, residents attempt to hold on to the traditions of Ramadan, but the festive spirit has been dimmed by the war. Amid the rubble, markets offer food and drinks. Israel and Hamas remain in a fragile ceasefire, which has led to the release of 33 Israeli hostages, mostly alive and some dead, and 2,000 Palestinian prisoners. Israel sent negotiators to Cairo in hopes of extending the truce, with a focus of securing more hostage releases. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, the atmosphere on this Ramadan is tense. Markets, which were normally bustling ahead of the Muslim holiday, were seeing fewer shoppers. Vendors say heightened security restrictions are keeping people away.
الوضع مختلف، انت ايام ما كناش نقدر نحك راسنا، يعني كانت الناس اكثر من البشر، اكثر من يعني اكثر شيء كان الناس تاكل وتشرب وفي شويه طمانينه. حاليا الوضع مختلف اختلاف جذري يعني.
And in Jerusalem, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is preparing for the influx of worshippers. The Waqf has installed protective coverings in the courtyards, but concerns remain over political and potential confrontations at the site, a frequent flashpoint in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. With Ramadan starting this weekend, both Palestinians and Israelis brace for what could be a volatile period. Will the ceasefire hold, or is another round of fighting on the horizon? The coming days may provide the answer.
After months of internal investigation, the IDF has presented its findings into failures during the lead-up to the Hamas invasion of southern Israel on October 7, 2023, and its response to the attack. More from ILTV's Steve Leibowitz.
The Army probe cites failures for years ahead of the invasion, in the final hours before the attack, and during the course of the terror group's slaughter and abductions. The top-level internal military investigation of the failures at the start of the war showed that the Army misread Hamas for years and left the South completely open to attack. Probe examined why the IDF failed to recognize the imminent invasion in the hours leading up to the attack and details the chaos that slowed the Army's response to the invasion. About 5,000 Hamas-led terrorists carried out the rampage as the Army failed to recognize the scope of the attack and then struggled to mount a response, with the bases closest to the border overrun and the chain of command broken. The Gaza Division, the regional unit responsible for defending the area, was defeated for several hours and was unable to effectively respond. The attack killed some 1,200 people in Israel, with another 251 kidnapped, most of the victims civilians. The report found that the IDF was over-reliant on having early warning to prepare for its defense. Troops that were deployed were massively outnumbered by the invading terrorists, and there was a lack of understanding of what Hamas was doing during the attack. The section dealing with perception found that prior to October 7th, the IDF believed that Hamas did not present a significant threat. Its tunnel networks had been degraded, and any cross-border attack would be stopped by Israel's high-tech border fence. IDF intelligence dismissed reports outlining Hamas's intent to launch a wide-scale attack as unrealistic. The investigation found that on the eve of the attack, there were 5 reported signs of unusual Hamas activity that night, but they did not believe that they signaled an imminent attack. It was wrongly assumed that Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar was a pragmatist, not looking for a major escalation, but rather focused on rocket-making capabilities. The probe determined that Hamas decided to attack back in April 2022 and chose the October 7th date in May of 2023. In addition to the 4 main topics, the Army investigated 41 separate battles and major incidents during the October 7th attack. The probes aimed at drawing operational conclusions for the IDF and did not look into policies relating to the political echelon.
The U.S. Justice Department is stepping in to address the rise in anti-Semitism on college campuses, launching federal investigations into universities accused of failing to protect Jewish students. ILTV's Mayan Hoffman is outside the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem with more.
Thank you, Sivan. The U.S. Department of Justice has made a bold move that could force university campuses in the United States to take anti-Semitism more seriously. The Federal Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism announced on Friday that it plans to visit 10 university campuses where Jewish students and faculty experienced harassment since the October 7th massacre. This could serve as a wake-up call for all campuses that have failed to act. Let's take a look at my report. For the past 18 months, many students and even faculty have openly violated campus rules, making Jewish students feel unwelcome or even unsafe. Instead of enforcing consequences and restoring order, university leaders have mostly stayed silent or issued weak statements. But now, the Justice Department is stepping in. The task force, created under President Trump's executive order on additional measures to combat anti-Semitism, has made eliminating anti-Semitic harassment in schools a top priority. Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights Leo Terrell, who is leading the initiative, said the universities have failed to protect Jewish students and faculty from unlawful discrimination. During the visits, the task force will meet with university leadership, affected students and staff, local law enforcement, and community members to assess the situation and determine whether further action is needed. Terrell stated that the task force mandate is to bring the full force of the federal government to bear in its effort to eradicate anti-Semitism. These visits, he said, are just one of the many steps this administration is taking to deliver on that commitment. The 10 universities under investigation are Columbia, George Washington, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, New York University, Northwestern, UCLA, UC Berkeley, the University of Minnesota, and USC. Jewish advocacy groups in the United States have welcomed the move, saying federal scrutiny alone might be enough to push university leaders to take action. And that's the hope, that these campuses do become safer for Jewish students. Sivan will be watching closely to see if this makes a tangible difference.
And now for something a little bit more joyous, as Purim approaches with its festive toasts and Passover follows with the tradition of 4 cups. There's no better time to enjoy the rich flavors of Israeli wine. Barkan Winery, one of Israel's finest, offers the perfect pour for every celebration. Let's learn more.
This is our winery. We are one of the biggest wineries in Israel. We are located in Judean foothills. The winery was founded in the 19th century by the Friedman family in Petah Tikva. And in 2012, they built this visitor center. We have thousands of people that are coming every year to taste our wine from all Israel. We are making almost 15 million bottles of wine per year, red, white, rosé. The idea is to make, by the end, the best wine that we can get from our vines. This is the reason why we have vines in all the country, from the Negev, Judean foothills, and the Upper Galilee. We are going now to our barrel room. We have over than 5,000 barrels of wine. Aging in barrels, in wine barrels, can be between 6 months in the gold and reserve series until 25 months in our altitude, like superior. This year we are planting new different grapes like Pinot Gris, like Viognier, Roussanne, maybe Assertico and Yael, different grapes that we can get in 4 or 5 years, a new wine, very special. We are now in the bottling line. We are bottling between 10 and 12,000 bottles per hour. We have different kinds of bottles. All of them can go directly in our bottling line. All the wine that here in this warehouse is going to different clients all over the world. It can go to Australia, to Russia, to Europe, to USA, of course. We have a lot of wine from all our range of wine. This is our blush, 100% Caladoc from the Judean faithful. And this is Cabernet Sauvignon. They are coming from the Upper Galilee. The idea, what I am and all my staff working for, is to make a very soft wine that you drink 1 glass and not another one. We are waiting for you in our visitor center to taste with us our wine, to see the harvest, to see the grapes, to see the plot, the vineyards, and to understand how we are making so amazing wine in the winery.
Now let's take a look at the weather forecast. Clear skies expected around most of the country tonight, with temperatures reaching lows of around 10 degrees Celsius or 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Tomorrow we'll see clear skies alongside steady temperatures, seeing highs of 20 degrees Celsius or 69 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a wrap for today's news. For the latest updates from Israel on all your devices, be sure to follow our ILTV channels, subscribe to our newsletter, and explore our website, iltv.tv. Stay informed with the latest news straight from the heart of Israel. I'm Sivan Raviv. Be well, be safe, and thank you so much for watching.